Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Teresa Maston, the chairperson of the Department of Advertising and Public Relations. I'd like to thank the School of Journalism and the Muslim Studies Program for co-sponsoring Dr. Sahar Khamis' visit with us this week. It's been a great visit so far. Dr. Sahar Khamis is an associate professor in the Department of Communications at the University of Maryland, College Park. She's an expert on Arab and Muslim media and the former head of the Mass Communication and Information Science Department in Qatar University. Dr. Khamis has a PhD in Mass Media and Cultural Studies from the University of Manchester in England. She's a former Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative visiting professor at the University of Chicago. She's the co-author of several books: Islam.com, Contemporary Islamic Discourses in Cyberspace, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civil Engagement and Citizen Journalism, and the co-editor of the book Arab Women's Activism and Socio-Political Transformation, Unfinished Gender Revolutions. Additionally, she's authored and co-authored numerous book chapters, journal articles, conference papers, regionally and internationally in both English and Arabic. She's the recipient of a number of prestigious academic and professional awards, as well as a member of the editorial board of several journals in the field of communication in general and in the field of Arabic Muslim media in particular. Dr. Khamis is a media commentator and analyst, a public speaker, a human rights commissioner in the Human Rights Commission in Montgomery County, Maryland, and a radio host who presents a monthly radio show on U.S. Arab Radio, which is the first Arab American radio station broadcasting in the U.S. and Canada. And that's really just the beginning. So Dr. Khamis will engage with us, and then following that engagement, Dr. Salim Alabash, who's an associate professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, will moderate the Q&A session. And so I'd like to ask all of you to help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Khamis.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you here at MSU. And I want to really thank the Department of Advertising and Public Relations and the School of Journalism and the Muslim Studies program for hosting me. Many thanks to Professor Teresa for organizing and for her kind introduction. Many thanks to Dr. Salim Al-Habash for all his good efforts to make this visit happen, and to Ariana for all her help and support as well. The community has been very welcoming and very hospitable, I must say. I felt very much at home and very much welcomed and at ease. And I hope this is going to be a continuing and a long-term collaboration and cooperation between myself and this great community of MSU. So the title of my presentation this afternoon is Countering Islamophobia Online, New Strategies and Campaigns in Cyberspace. I am a scholar very quickly of Arab and Muslim media, as Dr. Teresa kindly introduced me. A lot of my work has been dealing with cyber activism, or more specifically, the role of social media and new media in the process of bringing about social and political change and transformation in the Arab and Muslim world. So a lot of my work has been dealing with how young people like yourselves have been engaging in this kind of activism, both online and offline. Also, as a scholar of women's studies and gender studies, I've also had a keen interest in women's role, especially in the midst of all of these uprisings and beyond, and the role that women have been playing both online and offline as activists, as journalists, as human rights, commissioners, as other many different roles in the Middle East region and beyond. So today we're going to be talking about the definitions of Islamophobia. We'll start with some basic definitions of the term. Also, the context of Islamophobia is a new name for an old phenomena. The causes of Islamophobia, the different waves of Islamophobia in the US, and I would also say globally. Mainstream American media and Islamophobia, how there have been some issues and some problems there. And of course, we're going to turn our attention to the most important aspect of today's presentation, which is really the double-edged sword effect of the internet and social media and new media as tools through which Islamophobia could thrive, but also could be countered and somehow overcome and fought. And we're going to give examples of some successful online campaigns and strategies that have been used in cyberspace. So I know some of you are definitely advertising and marketing and public relations students. So I hope that this part about targeting the right audience and also framing your message using the right techniques and strategies is going to resonate with many of you this afternoon. Some of the right and wrong approaches in terms of countering Islamophobia or dealing with the problem of Islamophobia, and then a final word, maybe a few questions or a few food for thought, and then we're going to open it up for discussion and your interesting questions. So the idea of fearing a certain group of people because of their own culture, belief, or religion, because they're different, is not a new phenomenon. It has been around for centuries, and this process of ethnic, racial, and religious profiling has been commonly referred to as stereotyping. So it's not something new to stereotype others or to just give them labels because they look or they act or they believe differently from us has been going on for a long time. Therefore, it could be said that Islamophobia, which is characterized by exaggerated and oftentimes also considered an irrational sense of dislike and hostility and fear towards Islam and Muslims, is a new phenomena or a new word, really a new word for an old phenomena or an old problem. So the label itself, Islamophobia, has not been around for a very long time, but the problem of racial, ethnic, and religious profiling and stereotyping of others, or we can call it the process of othering, right, with a capital O, that has been going on for a long, long time, for centuries, like we said. But of course, we're going to talk this afternoon, especially about the role of media and the role of social media in terms of being a double-edged sword in this respect. Other definitions in the book, Politics of Islamophobia, for example, the term is defined as an increasingly visible backlash against Muslims across Europe and the US. The term backlash here, in this particular case, encompasses many different negative acts and messages against Muslims. Under this definition, the acts do not have to inflict just bodily or physical harm. They can also inflict mental and psychological harm as well. So whenever you see a surge in Islamophobia, it can really be attacks on mosques, Islamic centers. People can, throw explosives at some of these places of worship. You can see women who are visibly Muslim, like myself, wearing the headscarf, we call it the hijab, being targets, easy targets, because of their visible identity of, being slandered or basically attacked physically or verbally. And all of that can have, of course, not just physical consequences, but also a mental, emotional, and psychological effects and consequences as well, which could be quite detrimental. On the Gallup website, for example, Islamophobia is defined as exaggerated fear, hatred, and hostility towards Islam and Muslims, which is perpetuated by negative stereotyping, resulting in bias, discrimination, and marginalization and exclusion of Muslims from social, political, and civic life. So whenever you have a negative phenomena like Islamophobia taking place, you actually have consequences. And some of these consequences could be exclusion, could be isolation, could be targeting, could be labeling. It can take many, many different negative forms. Sean Armstrong, in his book, Islam, A Religion of Peace and Inconvenient Truth, takes a different approach in defining Islamophobia because he wanted to include what specific parts of Islam brought fear into the hearts of others. So his definition, in that case, he talks about an allegedly irrational fear of losing life or liberty to Islamic rule merely because of the laws, sacred texts, or traditional practices of Islam. And in that particular case, I always remember the misinterpretations and misconnotations of certain terms like Sharia or Sharia law, or, oh my God, these new immigrant Muslims are going to create their own Sharia zones or Sharia city, whatever it may be. And of course, terms like jihad. And I always say these terms are oftentimes taken out of context. They're not properly understood. People don't understand the word Sharia, which basically means a path or a way. So it is meant to regulate Muslims' lives, but it's not supposed to mean anything beyond that. It's not supposed to, for example, make them change the laws of the land. So if you're living in the United States, you abide by the Constitution of the United States of America, right? But you abide by Sharia law in your own personal interactions in terms of your own, marital status, your relationship with other members of your community, you're practicing your religion, and so on. But it's not meant at all to inflict any form of fear of creating a parallel society or a parallel lifestyle, which is how, unfortunately, some Islamophobes have been using terms like Sharia or Sharia law or Sharia way of life to inflict this kind of exaggerated and irrational fear about Islam and Muslims. The same thing applies to terms like jihad, right? Oh my God, these Muslims are going to engage in jihad. It's going to become very dangerous and so on. And I always say the word jihad really means struggle, right? So your jihad can be, you want to get, your struggle is to try to get straight A's in all your classes, or to lose 30 pounds, which is like a huge jihad for sure. It's a big struggle. I mean, it is really a form of struggle that you are engaging in. And the greatest jihad of all times is your jihad against your own self, against your own desires and whims and wants, and trying to become really the disciplined and civil and constructive and useful person in society. So it has been taken out of context to refer to the actions of a small fringe of extremists and terrorists who have been unfortunately hijacking and exploiting the religion of Islam for their own skewed agendas and their own inappropriate and very much exploitative means and measures. Of course, to explain the process of Islamophobia in terms of some of the possible causes for Islamophobia, there are so many different reasons. Some people actually say it is because of the global racial structures through which resource distribution and disparities exist between different societies. So you see, for example, the fear of immigrants, right? This has been like a rising tone in politics, right? Oh my God, these brown skin or dark skin, people are gonna come to our country, they're gonna invade our country, they're gonna take over the economy, and they're gonna take over the jobs, right? So that has been also some kind of irrational fear, in this particular case, embedded in certain economic disparities or certain social and economic factors that kind of frame immigrants or minorities, people who happen to be Muslims or Arabs or simply coming from overseas, as the other with a capital O, and therefore they should be feared. And you see, for example, rhetoric like clash of civilizations or the West versus the rest, right? And you see policies like the Muslim travel ban 1 and Muslim travel ban 2. All of that, you can think of it as part and parcel of the same problem. Other definitions talk about unfounded hostility towards Muslims and therefore fear or dislike of all or most Muslims because of the actions of a small fringe of Muslims who have hijacked the Muslim faith. So again, we go to the same point about the actions of a small fringe somehow distorting the image of 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide in a very stereotypical, very negative, and very unfair way. And I always say the root cause of all of this is ignorance. Ignorance is the main problem here because people are always afraid of whatever they are ignorant about, right? So every time you're ignorant about something, you don't know about it, then that creates some kind of innate fear in you. And that's why I always say the best strategy to counter not just Islamophobia, but all forms of hatred, all forms of racism, discrimination, it is actually education, 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 awareness, listening, learning, opening up. In your case, as young people, study abroad programs, have friends from different parts of the world, engage in online dialogue sessions, get to know others, get to know your neighbors, other members of the community who don't look like you, because this is the best way, the best recipe to try to counter not just Islamophobia, but all forms of hatred and discrimination. Otherwise, as long as we have ignorance, we will always have perpetual problems, including Islamophobia, which is very much grounded in ignorance. So here are just some examples, some images, as you can see here. For example, these are some of the campaigns that are highly, Islamophobic. No to Islam, stop the invasion, stop the mosque, Islam, the new Nazism, all of that stuff. And of course, the story behind what is called Ground Zero, right? The resistance to building the Islamic Center there and all of that stuff. So these has been real threats in many different parts of the world, especially in the Western world. Europe has had even a huge share of Islamophobia, much more so compared to the US, although we have witnessed a surge in Islamophobia in the US due to a number of factors, which I'm going to talk about this afternoon as well in particular. But Europe really had a much worse problem of Islamophobia. And many of these campaigns, demonstrations have been quite harmful and threatening to the Muslim minorities there. In fact, according to a Gallup poll and survey globally, many Muslims reported they did not feel they're respected enough in Western countries, and many members of different societies as well, Americans, Canadians, other members of different communities said that they also think that Muslims are not treated with sufficient respect and with sufficiently welcoming attitude. It shows here 52% of Americans and 48% of Canadians said that Muslims are not treated with enough respect. And there are also smaller percentages in Italy, France, Germany, and Britain. They also read with the same perspective as well. So you might wish to look at also some of the updated statistics in that regard. So if you zoom in particular in the case of the US, there have been certain waves of Islamophobia here in the US. So each of them had, of course, its own reasons or its own causes and triggers. So there was one wave that came along with the Iran hostage crisis, during the time of President Jimmy Carter. The second wave was pretty much around the time of September 11th attacks, although I always tell my students that acted as a double-edged sword, believe it or not. As much as it increased the negative stereotypes and misperceptions about Islam and Muslims and Arabs as, oh my God, they're the threat, they're dangerous, they're terrorists, they're extremists on one hand. On the other hand, people became interested to learn about the Middle East and the Arab world and the Muslim world more than ever before. In fact, witnessed a surge in Middle Eastern studies centers, Islamic studies centers, Islamic studies programs, and people became much more interested to learn about this part of the world. Although I would say that one problem here is that in many cases, the lens through which this kind of interest or attention is given is through the very narrow lens of terrorism. So terrorism studies, countering terrorism studies, I'm like, okay, there are 1.8 billion Muslims. That's why when I wrote the first book, Islam.com, with my co-author, we deliberately wanted to show people the ordinary voices of ordinary people. What do ordinary Muslims talk about in their everyday lives? They don't talk about jihad. They don't talk about, the war in Afghanistan. They talk about things like, I want to find the perfect match for my life. I want to find the perfect life match. I want to find the good, husband for my daughter, right? I want to find the right school for my son. I want to find a good job, which is really a good fit for me. What are we going to eat tomorrow? They're ordinary people who talk about the kind of stuff that everybody else is talking about. And that's why it's very important when we talk about, Muslim studies, Arab studies, Middle Eastern studies, that we don't just narrow ourselves down to the very, very narrow lens of terrorism and countering terrorism, because that's doing a great disfavor. We have to broaden our horizons and our perspective beyond that as well. And then you have the third wave, which came with certain attacks like the Paris attacks, the San Bernardino, California, and Orlando, Florida. And then came, of course, the rhetoric that came in the 2016 presidential campaign, like, Islam hates us, all of this kind of presidential rhetoric at the time from candidate Trump kind of made things a lot worse for the Muslim community in America. And it also translated into actual tangible policies like Muslim Travel Ban 1 and Muslim Travel Ban 2, although I'll say that also was a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, yes, you had these types of policies, but on the other hand, there were Americans from across every walks of life, every color, religion, every, basically ethnic origin, background, sexual orientation. They came out and they raised banners and they said, we're all Muslims today, we're all Americans, everyone is welcome here, we welcome you as our neighbors. There was this also moment of solidarity, showing a lot of solidarity and support, which was great. And I would say the fourth wave is what we are witnessing now in the midst of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, since the year 2021 marks I'm not going to say, of course, celebrates, because there is nothing to celebrate about the attacks or the aftermath of these tragic attacks, for sure. It's a terrible act which should have never taken place in the first place. But I would say marking the 20th anniversary of September 11th attacks, and that is also in this particular year, conflated with or compounded with the war in Afghanistan and all the, the aftermath, the takeover of Taliban. We're worried about the status of women, what's going to happen to women and girls and their education and human rights and so on. So I would say that these two particular events, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and also the Afghanistan war, had some kind of compound effect or aggregate effect in bringing about what we can describe as the fourth wave of Islamophobia. The mainstream Western media and Islamophobia, right? So basically, as a professor of media and communication, that is something which is very important and really a subject of interest for me. Many mainstream Western media outlets, unfortunately, have been spreading negative images and distorted misrepresentations and stereotypes, and oftentimes even had hate speech against Islam and Muslims, linking them to acts of violence or extremism or terrorism, So although, for example, when you look at the facts, 96% of all terrorist attacks which were committed on US soil were committed by non-Muslims. They were committed mostly by right-wing white supremacist groups. But that's not the kind of discourse, and it's not the kind of rhetoric that you hear and see in the media, unfortunately, right? So there has been some research that actually showed that if a person who happens to have brown skin or happens to have an Arab name or happens to have a Muslim name is linked in any way, shape, or form with a crime that could be terrorist or extremist, they receive hundreds of times more coverage than if it was an average person who has, white skin and basically his name is Joe Smith. In the first case, his Arab origin and his Muslim identity is immediately highlighted and focused upon in the media. In the second case, nobody talks about this person's origin, background, or religion. That in and of itself, as communication students and media students, should think about this kind of what we call the media framing, how the message itself is framed. The wide outreach of these media venues and, of course, their immediate instant transmission actually magnifies the impact of many of these stereotypes and many of these negative images for huge audiences everywhere, which is a dangerous phenomenon. And this in turn resulted in an escalation in acts of violence and hatred against Muslims globally, especially in the West. We have seen, as I said before, instances of attacks on mosques and Islamic centers, women wearing the hijab, the headscarf. And according to Pew survey, there have been attacks which increased by 67% in the US after the election of former President Trump. This is also coupled with narrow focus on terrorism in international mainstream media. And that's one of my favorite points. There is this slogan of when it bleeds, it leads. When it bleeds, it leads simply means the media looks after stories that are framed around conflict, framed around hostility, framed around wars and conflict and bloodshed. So every time you have conflict and war and bloodshed, the cameras are going to be rolling and it's going to make the front page headlines. If you have interfaith dialogue, people are talking to each other in a very friendly way, they're neighbors, they're good friends, that doesn't make the headlines and nobody is interested. That creates a very dangerous, really kind of, I would say, inoculation of fear inside ourselves. We're living in a very scary world, right? But I always say there is always a good person doing good work out there in the world, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, I don't care, from whatever background. Why don't we hear and see the stories of these people sufficiently in the media? So maybe that's something for you guys to do, right? Once you graduate from here, go out and find these good people and write stories about them and do your next campaigns and advertisements and marketing and news reporting on that. The internet and Islamophobia, it could be said that the internet has really played a double-edged sword when it comes to the phenomena of Islamophobia. So on one hand, it increases the bias, prejudice, discrimination, and basically a lot of the Islamophobes have used social media and new media to spread this kind of fear and to create their own campaigns. For example, there is one Twitter campaign which was called #BanIslam, a very highly Islamophobic campaign, as the name implies, ban Islam, tried to shed light on only Islamic extremists, this very small, tiny fringe of the 1.8 billion world Muslims, and using, of course, digital media and new media. However, the internet also offers a unique opportunity and unprecedented opportunities for Muslims to respond and to react to these efforts and these particular attempts by creating their own countering Islamophobia campaigns in cyberspace. So you can really say comfortably, it has this kind of double-edged sword effect, depending on who is using it. I always tell my students, the internet is simply a tool. It depends on who is using it and for what purpose, and that really makes all the difference, right? So somebody who is Islamophobic can start a campaign like Ban Islam, but then we're gonna have a lot of campaigns, that we're gonna talk about it in a second, that are countering Islamophobia and resisting it and fighting it in cyberspace as well. So it's a tool, and it pretty much depends on how you are using this tool and for what purpose. So some successful online campaigns. In response to many of the Islamophobic efforts and campaigns, American Muslims started to rely on cyber activism. We talked about that, the phenomena through which you can use the internet to advance a certain cause, which is difficult to advance offline. by launching their own countering Islamophobia campaigns online. So this is a phenomenon that some Muslims jokingly or sarcastically started to call it, oh, it's our e-jihad, like electronic jihad, like, struggle or battle that we are launching or starting in cyberspace. And for example, Unity Productions Foundation released a very good YouTube video. I'd love for you guys to check it later on. It is called American Muslims, Facts versus Fiction. And this short documentary dispels many of the misconceptions and stereotypes about American Muslims, such as portraying them as newcomers to the US, they're radicalized, they're extremists, or they are all Arabs, right? The first thing I tell my students in my Arab media course at the University of Maryland, not all Arabs are Muslim and not all Muslims are Arabs. That's a very important thing to remember, right? The Arab world has Muslims, it has Christians, it has Druze, it has Maronites, it has Jews, it has people from different religious orientations, right? And definitely, when you talk about the Muslim world, the largest Muslim country in the world is not an Arab country, it's Indonesia, which is not an Arab country, right? So we don't want to conflate also these terms. However, in the realm of media and communication and on social media, oftentimes you see Arab/Muslim being conflated as if they are, interchangeable, but in fact, they're not. So this particular really, really good video, which is called American Muslims, Facts versus Fiction, wanted to counter, using this YouTube video, some of these particular stereotypes by saying, hey, American Muslims are not newcomers, right? Especially the African Americans, Muslims. Many of them, they actually were among the very, very first people who came to this country, and this country was built on their own backs and their own shoulders. So they're not newcomers. That is a misperception. Extremists and radicals, give me a break. Look how many, successful Muslim doctors, engineers, professors, teachers, nurses, essential workers are contributing to the US economy and US society in so many significant ways. And of course, as we said, not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs. So all of that are very important things that people just need to know. And unfortunately, it is lost on them in the middle of the stereotyping we were talking about a moment ago. Also, the release of the hashtag #WhyIslam and the hashtag Discover Muhammad campaigns, which relied on a combination, very interesting combination of both online websites and billboards. So very brilliantly, I'll show you some examples here. This campaign, which says, looking for answers in life, discover Prophet Muhammad. It's actually a campaign that uses both the online as well as the billboards. And that's really a unique strategy because not everybody is online 24/7. We assume that everybody is having access to high-speed internet 24/7. But I'm sure you all know the term digital divide. There are those who have access to the internet. There are those who don't have access to the internet. And the digital divide is pretty much alive and well, not just globally between one country and another, but even inside the same country, depending on your zip code, depending on where you live. It's a rural area, remote area, you're living in a village or in an urban area, gender digital divide, all of that stuff is very real. So this campaign brilliantly, and of course generation as well, the older generation versus younger generation when it comes to digital technology and so on, try to use both the billboards in the street as well as the online campaign as well. Another campaign which I particularly love, Jesus is a prophet of Islam. Not very many people know that, but in the Holy Quran, there is a whole chapter which is called Maryam. So it tells the story of the Virgin Mary and the story of the Immaculate Birth of Jesus Christ. And they're very, very revered and very highly respected in Islam. And in Islam, actually, to be a Muslim, you have to, underline the word have to, believe in all the different religious books and revelations and messengers and prophets. So if you deny, for example, that Prophet Moses was a prophet or Jesus or Virgin Mary, then you are not a Muslim. So it's an inherent part of your own belief. And I said that one time in a church and everybody looked at me like, what? They did not know this and they never heard it before. And I was like, oh my God, what a shame, because these are like principles and basics that everybody should know. But unfortunately, we need more education and more awareness, like I said at the beginning. Yeah. So this is again another one. Who is Muhammad? You have questions, get answers, again using online and billboards as well in the campaign Why Islam, which was a very successful campaign. Other successful online campaigns, Muslim users also came up with the hashtag Muslim Rage campaign, to counter the anti-Muslim campaign, which is called Ban Islam. This hashtag in particular highlighted the bias and hate that Muslims were receiving, but in a very humorous, funny, and witty way. So they were just using the term rage, Muslim rage, as a funny way. And then they basically started to say things which are very funny in the campaign. Like, for example, if your friend's name is Jack and you are riding on a plane, you're a Muslim, you're riding on a plane, your friend's name is Jack, don't say hi, Jack, because that can get you in trouble. Things like that. And it went viral because people love humor, right? They all like to have a good laugh, basically, right? So people were just laughing about it. If your son's name happens to be Jihad and you're a Muslim, don't you dare go after him in the airport saying Jihad, Jihad, because you definitely know what's going to happen to you. So it was all funny. It was all humorous. So they just used the hashtag Muslim Rage as a way to get people kind of interested to read the hashtag. Once they got there, oh my God, it was just super funny and hilarious. So they were really wise enough to use humor in this particular case, because had they used any kind of aggressive rhetoric or any kind of anger, or they responded to this Ban Islam campaign with hateful messaging, this is a very important point, hateful messaging or aggressive messaging or anger or any of that stuff, it would be counterproductive. It would backfire, because then you are really playing into the hands of Islamophobes. They're going to say, look, I told you these Muslims are aggressive, they're hostile, they're very scary people. Here they are, right? So that's why I always say using any form of aggressive answer or any kind of angry answer becomes detrimental and counterproductive. Using something like witty humor is super smart, and it was really very successful. Another famous successful campaign, for example, was American Muslim women who actually started a campaign called hashtag Can You Hear Us Now? So the story of this particular hashtag, I don't know if many of you know it, but during the presidential campaign of 2016, there was this incident of Mr. Khizr Khan and his wife, Mrs. Ghazala Khan. Their son was a martyr. He lost his life as an American Muslim fighting for this country, for the US. And when the son's image came up on the screen, on a big screen like this one, and the mother saw her son's image, naturally as a mom, she was very touched and she was just silent. So at the time, candidate Trump said a comment saying, oh, and his wife, he's talking about Mr. Khizr Khan, his wife was standing next to him, silent. She did not talk. She cannot talk, or maybe she is not allowed to talk. So very stereotypical. And the woman, Mrs. Ghazala Khan, she came in a media interview, in a TV interview afterwards, and she said, I'm not silenced. Nobody is silencing me. I am just a mother. When I saw this big picture of my son, whom I lost, right? He's not here anymore. Naturally, I was very touched. I was very emotional. And that's why I didn't talk. So to respond to this, Muslim American women came up with the hashtag, Can You Hear Us Now? And they started to say, I'm an astronomist. I work with NASA. Nobody silenced me. Hashtag, Can You Hear Us Now? Another one says, I'm a professor. When I go in the class, nobody talks but me. Hashtag, Can You Hear Us Now? I am writing this hashtag now as my husband is washing the dishes. I have the loudest voice in the house. Hashtag, Can You Hear Us Now? So they started to use really examples from their daily lives as mothers, as PhD holders, as professionals, as doctors, as engineers, as people working with NASA, to say, we are not silenced. We are here and we have a very loud voice. So this campaign was an attempt on their part to counter the negative misperceptions and negative portrayal of Muslim women as silent, as oppressed, as invisible, who have no voice. And they wanted really to give themselves voice by using this hashtag, which also went viral and became very successful. So they actually used the Twitter platform here as a means to amplify their own voices and to make sure that they're heard, their identities could become visible. And I always say it's also a way to counter the quote unquote save the Muslim woman syndrome. There's always the save the Muslim woman. Oh, what are we going to do to help these poor Muslim women who are oppressed and suppressed and silenced and all of that stuff? I'm like, the best thing to do is to listen and to understand. Listening, understanding, awareness, and education is the way to go. But they don't need saving. They just need to be understood and heard and listened sufficiently. That's the most important thing. So I always say counter the quote unquote save the Muslim woman syndrome. And more recently, some Muslim women also started to launch another campaign. I would like you to also check this one, please, online if you can later on. It's called hashtag Hands Off My Hijab. Hands Off My Hijab is a campaign that some Muslim women started in cyberspace to counter the campaign or to resist the campaign of the hijab ban and the niqab ban in France. The niqab is this is the niqab. Here we go. I guess the whole world is now wearing a niqab. so the niqab means the face veil, honestly, when you cover your face, right? So the ban, of course, in France has an issue, a big issue, because they think everyone should dress the same, act the same, behave the same, otherwise you are not French. It's a huge problem. I know a very smart university professor, she had to go and raise a case in court because she was wearing a headscarf. She was brilliant, she deserved the position. She was denied the position for no reason except her hijab. And of course, she had to go through a legal battle to win this particular case. So it's really heartbreaking. So Muslim women started to go online and say, hashtag hands off my hijab, don't touch my hijab. This is my right to choose and my right to respect my religion and to also show my identity in the way I choose to express it, right? So that became also a very important campaign which went viral in cyberspace. Another example, which is also a very funny campaign, you will love this one as well. It is called hashtag Muslims Report Stuff. Very, very funny campaign. That was also in response to something that came up in the 2016 presidential campaign. During the second presidential debate, then candidate Trump was asked by a Muslim woman, she asked him, what are you gonna do in order to overcome Islamophobia? And he said, well, you in the Muslim community, whenever you see anything, you should report it right away. So basically that means that every Muslim is someone who is suspicious and there's always something that's going on that's fishy in our community. And therefore, every time we see something, we should immediately go and report it to the authorities. So what did these brilliant young Muslims do? They started a very funny campaign called hashtag Muslims Report Stuff. So they said something like, my mother cooks the exact same soup every single day. I'm reporting her to the authorities. Hashtag Muslims Report Stuff, or things like, oh, my brother, he always leaves his room untidy and never makes his bed. I have to make it for him every single day. So please, hashtag Muslims Report Stuff. So it's basically talking about the very mundane thing to show how silly it is to actually say that, the Muslims should report the stuff because the stuff that's happening in everybody's life every single day is the same mundane stuff that happens to everyone else. That was the gist of the campaign in a very brilliant and very funny and witty way. Another also very good campaign was called the Islamophobia pill, again, using a very funny, sarcastic style. CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, started actually a campaign which is, they designed, I hope you can look it online, they designed a box that looks like ibuprofen, but instead it said Islamophobia, right? It looks exactly like ibuprofen. It has on the box, this pill is supposed to fight all symptoms of Islamophobia. If you experience symptoms of Islamophobia, take this particular pill 3 times a day after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If the symptoms don't go away, visit your next local mosque and try to reach out to some Muslim friends and get to know them better, right? So basically, it was making fun of the whole notion of Islamophobia in a funny and witty way and saying, if you have these symptoms, take the Islamophobia pill and your symptoms should disappear and so on. So it was a very funny campaign as well. There was a campaign called hashtag Muslims Are Speaking Out, which I actually participated in, that invited a group of Muslims from different backgrounds to appear on social media and to, really kind of very clearly and verbally denounce all forms of terrorism and extremism, which, by the way, the Muslim community has been doing systematically for the last 20 years. It is just that the media does not cover it sufficiently. And it's not just in the US. Globally, there have been marches. They went out in huge numbers in London, in other parts of Europe, in many parts of the world, and they have raised banners, they've raised slogans, they've written letters, imams, in the mosques and so on talked about it, public figures talked about it. So, when people say, oh no, but why aren't Muslims speaking out against terrorism? Please do me a favor. The next time you hear this argument, please respond to it and say, they have been talking, but they have not been heard. This is a very important point. They have been talking, but they have not been heard, because the media did not pay attention or enough attention to these voices that have been systematically and regularly denouncing terrorism over the last 20 years. So all of these are examples of social media campaigns that try to really counter and push back against Islamophobia using platforms on social media like Twitter, like YouTube, blogs, and other types of social media platforms. The goals and objectives of all of these campaigns was to fight against all the different negative and distorted media stereotypes and misrepresentations and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims, to fight the sweeping generalizations about Islam and Muslims through resisting the view that there's just one monolithic identity and culture and lifestyle. When you have 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide, you cannot fit everyone in the same box, right? Because an Indonesian Muslim woman is going to be very different from a Canadian Muslim man, very different from an Indian Muslim, and so on. So there's definitely diversity because of culture, because of history, because of lifestyle, and it's wrong to put everybody in the same basket and to perceive them as one monolithic community or identity. Also to promote better understanding and genuine awareness about Islam and Muslims, and to resist the gender profiling of Muslim women in particular by emphasizing their strength, courage, resilience, empowerment, and public visibility. And those of you who have been monitoring the Arab Spring uprisings, right? Women played a very pivotal, very iconic role in the midst of these uprisings and beyond. They were not just there to support men or to be good, carers. They were in the front lines of resistance, taking bullets, being arrested, being harassed, in some cases raped, in some cases exiled, and in some cases killed. So they paid the price for their own activism, and they're still paying the price until this moment, defying all the negative stereotypes about Muslim women and Arab women being silenced and voiceless and repressed and weak. And also another very important goal and objective was to highlight the similarities and overlaps rather than the differences and distinctions between Muslims and non-Muslims. I always say, whatever unites us is much more than whatever divides us. It's a very important point. Unfortunately, in this day of age, just today I was talking earlier in a panel about polarization, about race and cultural wars and polarization. It's very important to remember that whatever brings us together, the commonalities we have, the things we have in common are huge and much greater than whatever brings us apart, right? But unfortunately, some politicians don't want us to see it this way. They're invested in polarization because polarization serves their own agenda. And that is a very dangerous thing. We need to pay attention to this and to counter polarization and to invest more in solidarity and building relationships and finding our common ground rather than searching for our differences. So the right and wrong approach is to counter Islamophobia. Being proactive is always better than being reactive. You know the saying, being the firefighter or being the fire preventer is much better than being the firefighter. In other words, prevention is better than cure. You don't wait for a disaster to happen and then you start to respond to it. It is much better to plan. It is much better to be proactive. It's much better to take actions instead of just waiting and then being on the defense. So in that particular context, I'd say, yes, the media has a role and all of that stuff. Also, the Muslim community is starting to realize the importance of bridge building as well. It's a two-way street. It's never a one-way street, right? So if you talk about stereotyping, you can stereotype me. I can also have stereotypes about you, which may not be necessarily accurate. Okay? If you talk about the relationship between the West and the Middle East or the Arab world or the Muslim world, we also can have mutually negative stereotypes about each other. So it's a two-way street. So the Muslim community is now realizing the importance of investing in civic engagement, running for office, building new charities and helping the homeless and the needy and the poor, not just within the Muslim community, but reaching out to the other members of the community at large who are not necessarily Muslim. And this has been very, very clear in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many Muslims have been really donating and giving a lot to charities and helping the homeless and the needy and the poor and reaching out to others who are non-Muslims. And there is research that shows that if you know just one single Muslim, you are really much more immune to Islamophobia and much less likely to engage in Islamophobic discourses or actions than if you don't know anyone at all, just one. Just one person can make a huge difference. So think about this. So I call this the proactive approach. Be engaged in your own society, in your own community. Muslims need to reach out to others, and others need to reach out to Muslims as well. So it's a reciprocal, two-way relationship. It's a two-way street. Being open and frank about the problem of Islamophobia, also about the problem of extremism and condemning terrorism without being excessively apologetic and overly ashamed. This is a very important balance. We need to speak up and say, yeah, terrorism is wrong. Somebody like Baghdadi does not represent me. I don't agree with ISIS. I don't agree with Al-Qaeda. At the same time, it is very unhealthy for young people to grow being scared to death every time they see an act of terror on TV, that they're gonna be stigmatized and somehow shamed, and somebody is gonna point their fingers at them and feeling like, oh my God, they have to be excessively apologetic and always ashamed. This is not a good and healthy feeling either. So acknowledge the problem, speak against it, but also at the same time, put it in the right size and the right magnitude. Avoiding violence, aggression, and offensive language, encountering Islamophobia, and instead using other successful strategies like we talked about, humor and funny style. Because honestly, if you engage in acts of violence, number one, it's gonna perpetuate the problem. It's gonna, as we said before, backfire and create negative consequences rather than positive consequences. And also you cannot say my religion is a religion of peace and my prophet is a prophet of peace, and then you commit acts which are against these principles of peace, right? So you cannot be angry that somebody showed Prophet Muhammad in a bad way in a cartoon and then go out and burn a store or break something or become angry, because then you're going against the legacy of the very same prophet that you are saying that you are defending. It doesn't make sense. So if you want to defend your religion, whether it is Islam, Christianity, Judaism, any other religion, the best way to do so is to live and to embody the values of this religion in your own actions and your own behavior. And by doing so, then we become a much more civil and much more peaceful society at large. Of course, humor in particular was very important, because you can say things in humor that you cannot say in serious talk, right? So sometimes when you are just cracking a joke and saying something funny and everybody laughs, and then they realize, oh my God, yeah, but this is also so silly. Why would we ask Muslims to report stuff when in fact they're just ordinary people like me and you? So in a way, you can say things in humor that you cannot say in serious talk. It can become a very, very effective and very powerful mechanism. So a final word, and I'm going to end here. It is very important to point out and to bear in mind that we cannot understand the phenomenon of Islamophobia as a detached or separate process from other interrelated ongoing phenomena such as xenophobia, racism, white supremacy, sexism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination, prejudice, and hatred, which have been on the rise recently. In other words, you have a lot of issues going on here which are somehow interconnected and interrelated. Having this broader outlook on this important issue enables us to contextualize it within the broader framework of multiple forms of injustices, and therefore facilitates coming up with innovative strategies to combat these ongoing multiple challenges collectively and historically and holistically in a well-coordinated and well-orchestrated fashion. In other words, I look at Islamophobia as just one branch in a bigger tree, right? And this bigger tree includes many different forms of evil, okay? Whether it is violence against Black men, whether it is actions against, for example, members of certain minorities or immigrants, Asian hatred, anti-Semitism. I think they're all related. And therefore, if you want to fight the battle of Islamophobia, it is very important to create some kind of solidarity building, coordination, cooperation, because we are all in this together. This is a very important thing to bear in mind. Thank you so much.